Hi all. So I have been promising a follow-up to the previous video. Insulin resistance, is it a good thing, a survival mechanism? And I explained how insulin resistance, which is the forerunner to prediabetes and diabetes and which promotes obesity, is something that has evolved over the eons and the generations to help the human race survive nutritional challenges like famines and long sea voyages, climate catastrophes like droughts and floods, and just the requirements of hunting, gathering, going on expeditions, going on long treks across the continent to find new places to live, and that interrupted supply of nutrition and that need to draw on all your stored calories made insulin resistance, which is the ability to store every calorie away as fat for future use, such a useful trait to have. So if you put on weight easily, and particularly around the middle or upper body, and you've got a family history, or you've got a family history of type 2 diabetes or heart disease, you're actually hardy stock, you're good stock. So unfortunately, I talked about how the environment has changed and we no longer need insulin resistance. We no longer need to be able to store calories away for future use. Well, how do we kind of encourage our body to start to let go of some of that stored calories, some of that stored fat? And the way we do that is we actually ask our genetics, ask our environment to time travel backwards to when our genetics worked for us. So we start undertaking actions that work with our genetics. So one of the things that the insulin resistance worked with was having intermittent supply of food. So you'd have to go periods where you were not eating much, periods where you were fasting because of lack of access to calories. So how that worked was that the insulin receptor. Remember, I talked about the receptor being that little lock that the insulin key fits into. That receptor, if you keep hitting that receptor with insulin because you keep eating, that receptor eventually desensitizes and becomes more resistant. So you end up needing more insulin to deal with that receptor. So you end up needing to contend with the side effects of large amounts of frequent amounts of insulin, which is, as I said, weight gain, because insulin's a weight gain hormone. So it's best to keep the action of insulin on the receptor intermittent, because if you give that receptor a break from insulin, then the receptor doesn't desensitize, it stays sensitive. You remain more insulin sensitive. The way to do that, and you've heard me say the word intermittent a few times, you would have heard of intermittent fasting. So the first thing to do to keep that receptor sensitive is to not keep hitting it with insulin by having breaks from eating. And the easiest and probably the most day-to-day best way to intermittently fast is just to eat 3 times a day. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and have a good 12-hour gap or more between dinner and then overnight to breakfast. So 3 times a day, eat, and try to reduce snacks in between. Or you can do all your eating in an 8-hour window, say between 12 and 8 p.m. or between 10 and 6 p.m. So that's one of the ways. Eat 3 times a day and fast overnight. Secondly, now I talked about the biggest driver of insulin being carbohydrates. So the more carbs you eat, the more insulin you have to release to deal with the carbs to get that sugar into the cell. So the second most important, or second in the list of important measures, is to control the amount of carbs there is in a meal, and improve or maximize the meal composition so that you are no longer driving large amounts of insulin. The best way to do that is your meal should have 1 palmful of carbs. So that's rice or roti or bread or potato or pumpkin or corn or pasta should just be one handful, one palmful. There should be an equal palmful of protein. So that might be a protein shake, that might be a meat source of protein, that might be eggs, that might be tofu, that might be cheese, that might be legumes. And that should also be about the size of your palm. And then 2 palmfuls of vegetables. I always say your mobile phone size of your carbs, mobile phone size of protein, and 2 mobile phone sizes of veggies. So your meal composition, that'll slow down and reduce the overall amount of insulin. How is that? Because the fiber in the vegetables and some of the fiber in the carbs actually draws water into your gut. And when you've got water in your gut, the digestion of carbs is slowed down. Your stomach empties a bit more slowly. It draws water into your stomach. It draws water into your gut, and then the carbs actually cross from the gut into the bloodstream more slowly. And so your insulin, instead of spiking like that, is reduced to a slow peak. So that's and the side effect of insulin's weight gaining or fat storing abilities is not just determined by the amount of insulin, but by the height of the peak. So we talked about meal composition, and we've talked about eating 3 times a day. The third thing is activity. It doesn't have to be in any way complex. Get a pedometer or use the pedometer on your phone or download a pedometer app and aim for 10 to 15,000 steps a day. On top of that, some resistance work, and I just say squats and planks, and you should be able to find good form for squats and planks on any YouTube video. So you only need to do a 30-second plank to start. Maybe just start with a 10-second plank and build up, and 3 sets of 12 squats. Okay, and once you can really, you're doing that with ease, you start holding textbooks or weights or cans or bottles of water as you do your squats to add resistance. And you only need to do that 2 to 3 times a week and 10,000 steps a day. Why? Number one, activity is shown to keep the insulin receptor sensitive. Secondly, the more muscle you have through the resistance work, remember I said that the sugar has 3 destinies in the cell. Destiny number 1 is it gets converted to energy. Destiny number 2 is it gets repackaged as starch. And destiny number 3, what's left over, is stored as fat. Well, the more muscle you have, the more destiny 1 and 2 take over, and less is left over to store as fat. That's because muscle has a lot of mitochondria, which are the energy-burning batteries of the cells. The more mitochondria you have, the more energy your body burns. And secondly, muscle is the storage organ for glycogen. So the more muscle you have, the more of the carbs get converted into glycogen, and the less gets converted into fat. So we've got eating 3 times a day, not eating between meals, meal composition, and activity and resistance work. The fourth thing is sleep. Sleep is so important because sleep reduces cortisol. Cortisol is a flight or fight hormone, and it's very, very difficult to lose weight when you have high levels of cortisol. Cortisol actually works to pull sugar out of your cells and resists the action of insulin because cortisol thinks you're going to need a burst of energy soon. When you lose sleep or when you're under chronic stress, your cortisol levels go high and they pull the sugar out of the cell and they resist the effects of insulin. So your body then has to produce double or triple the amount of insulin just to deal with the cortisol. And we deal with the cortisol pulling the sugar out. As we don't end up going, when we lose sleep, we don't end up using all that sugar we've pulled out of cells. It's not like we've got a stress response because we're about to go on a big hunt and hunt down a lion, or we've got a stress response because we're going into war. We get a stress response from a bad day at work. We get a stress response from not sleeping. So we don't use that stress response to get more active the way we used to. So the sugar comes out of the cell and hangs around, and the body goes, well, I better put it back in the cell, doubles or triples the amount of insulin to get that sugar back into the cell. And we know what insulin does. It helps you gain weight. So you've really got to prioritize sleeping 6 to 8 hours a night minimum. And if you've got a lot of stress, and I'm not one to say glibly, anything will work with stress. I am a Christian, and I do find that having that perspective that this will all fade, and in eternity we will have perfect pure justice and perfect pure mercy, kind of gives me a buffer. So if prayer, meditation, faith helps, it helps. But I know that it's not always that easy. Not even for me with my, philosophies about it. Having someone to talk to, having a long bath. If you've got someone to cuddle, I don't. But if you've got someone to cuddle, that's lovely. And sleep and massages. So things that relax and release your cortisol. I need to probably get more regular massages. So we've talked about not eating between meals. We've talked about meal composition. We've talked about steps and resistance at work. We've talked about sleep. The fifth thing is to keep your insulin modified and not to have your insulin too high, is a few little tricks and tips. They've found that vinegar with a meal reduces the peak of digestion and absorption across the gut. So a little bit of vinegar with your meals, with your salad or with your veggies is helpful. Sometimes if I've overdone the carbs, I just have a little bit of vinegar and water, and it seems to cut that blood sugar reaction that I get if I have too many carbs. And coffee. They've found that coffee reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes. I don't want all the caffeine, so I drink decaf coffee. I'll have a cup of standard coffee if I need a bit of caffeine. Say I'm waking up in the morning or I'm about to head into a long day at work. But generally I rely on decaf coffee because it's not the caffeine in the coffee that seems to be protective against type 2 diabetes. It's actually the polyphenols or the chemicals in the coffee that help. And alcohol, if you have a drink a day, and don't start drinking if you don't drink, but if you have just one small drink a day, it appears to also help reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes through acting on reducing insulin resistance. The mechanisms are debated. So there you go, there you have it.